Okay, so I'm talking to you as a psychotherapist. So my main interest is in what the unconscious tells us about who we are, what we're doing, and how that interacts particularly with social media and technology. So the distinction, in a way, let me just see what time it is here. The distinction, in a way, is not online psychology in the sense of where people's eyes are attracted to what kind of buttons or conversion rates, that sort of thing, but the meaning that is made of people's interaction with technology. So we're going to think a bit about that today. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves, in a sense, is who am I? And I mean that in the most profound way, existential and psychodynamic. So this guy should look pretty familiar to you. I'm kind of doing this thing right now. Okay, so this is my presenter persona, but we all know it's not the whole picture. There's more to me than there is that. There's my selfie on the tube persona, might be one of them that some people have access to and other people won't have access to. There's my uncle persona, which other people will have access to, and then yet again, more other people won't have access to. So I'm kind of saying we've got these tranches of self that we share with some individuals and that we don't share with other individuals. Here's the sort of academic Freudian psychoanalytic self with the tomes of books behind me, looking serious. This is my professional persona, which again is presented in particular areas and not other areas. So which one of these is me? What's going on, and what do I do with this kind of multifarious, multi-vectored psychodynamic self? And these are only the things that I'm aware of and that I want you to be aware of. I mean, where does Glastonbury's self fit into this picture, and who do I share that with? This was the safer of pictures to share with you today, because I'm still making choices about what I'm going to share with you based on what's going on for me. So I want you to think about who you are, yeah? Not just how you present yourself, but who you are when you're presenting yourself. And we're going to do a little bit of that today, and we're going to start by thinking about our online selves. So I think about Facebook, for example. This is another representation of myself that has elements of all of these other representations. But when I represent myself like this, what's lying in the parts of myself that aren't represented this way through this medium? Where do they go? Yeah? And do they somehow maneuver their ways onto the scene in ways that we don't know? And what are we doing, actually, when we present ourselves to others through social media? So I want you to think for a moment on your own terms. You don't have to share this with anyone. But how do you see yourself? So what is your image of yourself, your identity, your subjectivity? What's that all about? How do I want to be seen by others? So these things are fundamentally connected, because when we see ourselves, we imagine ourselves as being seen by others, even sort of internalized others. So what I'm getting at here is fundamentally we are absolutely relational. We are not isolated individuals. We're always imagining in some way how we're being perceived, super egoically how we ideally wish to perceive ourselves, and how we present ourselves to get those needs met. But they're not always the most honest needs, because they're not always the whole picture of who we are. So how do I see others, and then what gets in the way? So again, from my discipline of psychoanalysis, we think about transference and projection. So I don't just see my boss, but I see my authoritarian father, in a sense, and I'm reacting to my boss as if he's the authoritarian father when he may not be. So we're not always getting an honest view of who the other person is. And then how do others want to see me? Now, this want to is kind of important, because there's an implicit unconscious thing going on there within those transferences. So we show up and somebody sees us in a particular kind of a way, and this happens in a particular kind of a way over Facebook or over other kinds of social media that we're going to be discussing shortly. There's also an element of control that I'm going to go into. So how are we controlling what others see of us and wanting them to see of us? Okay, and how do we go about it? So there's an intentional way in which we go about it, explicit, but there's also an implicit way, which is the one that I'm most interested in. So if you think about a Facebook profile, you think about the metadata, you think about stuff that you can see, this is what we call content. I'm interested in process, and as we know, process is probably about 90% of what's going on. Content is just the tip of the iceberg. So we can't actually really know about people's meaning systems by just looking at content, though we can know a lot of other stuff. So just to think about how you perceive yourselves, what you prefer to present and what you don't prefer to present, I'd like us to do a little bit of an exercise. Now, it's really important because you have to understand all of the 5 steps here thoroughly before you begin the exercise, so pay close attention. I will tell you when to start. Okay, so step one, I imagine in a group like this, you will all have access to your devices. So smartphone, tablet, laptop is fine. Please have it in your laps. Ensure that your device is unlocked. So if you're finger-coded, unfinger-code it, put in your codes, make sure it's available. Hand your device to the person sitting to your left. If you're sitting at the end of the row, you can switch with someone in front or behind you. You're giving away your device here. No, don't do it yet, don't do it yet. Wait until you, don't do it yet. You're actually doing much better for an experiment in social compliance now than you are in psychology. Wait till you've read all of the instructions, yeah? So if you've passed it on, pass it back. Yeah? Okay, so you will be handing your device on unlocked to somebody beside you. When you've received that device, snoop. Okay. 3 minutes to snoop around somebody else's device. Okay. There's one more step. Okay. Okay, what the hell just happened here? Yeah? That's process. Okay, that's what I want you to understand. So take a minute to think about what just happened with you. Talk to the person next to you, like 90 seconds, and then we'll get a couple comments from the audience. Okay, you're gonna want to start to wrap it up. And begin to draw your attention back up here. Thank you. I'm sensing a lot of energy in the room. So I'm curious, maybe 2 or 3 people, just put up your hand and just say maybe what you shared. What the experience was like? Yeah, 2 in the front.
Yeah, well, I was concerned about sharing private images, but of course the lady next to me is a feminist pornographer. And she wasn't. You can find them on the internet, although she said to me, my screensaver is a picture of my son in the bath. And she said, I've been much more concerned about you having photographs of your children, almost naked, than I would be of having photographs of myself naked, which I thought was really interesting. Sharing children. Something, I think about doing. I have a lot more resistance about putting my pictures of my children on Twitter, for example, where people start attacking them.
Yeah, so it's not just your privacy, but you might be compromising somebody else's privacy because you're holding lots of people's privacy, text messages, sent photographs, all that sort of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, so we had a conversation where I accused my neighbor here of lying. It turns out he's in strategic communication, so I was pretty much on the spot. So because I'm a combination of an academic and a very boring person, I have nothing to hide. So I was actually not worried at all.
Okay.
I thought there's nothing on here that will interest anybody, so have a look.
Okay, thank you. So I have one more thought in the back. You felt sort of like ethically that you couldn't have a look.
Somebody else has got my phone, and there's pictures of my kids and emails and work and stuff like that. That kind of stopped me even following on this lady's phone.
That's really encouraging.
I just think you could not click into any of the apps and services on that.
Okay, how many people shared that experience, a reluctance to look at somebody's, a pretty fair number? Okay, so I think you kind of get a sense of what I'm getting at here. There are things that we prefer to share and there are things that we don't prefer to share. That you will have an experience if somebody sees that part of you that you'd prefer to leave in another room, as it were, for other people. Yeah? And then there's also the experience of the person looking, a reluctance to look, a feeling like you're prying into privacy, maybe also a perverse curiosity to see what's there, to see if you can find the thing, to find out something about that person that kind of circumvents a curated image. Or you're just boring and you don't have anything you need to share, in which case you have fewer worries. So this is also kind of about how we're each individually multiple in the ways in which we're multiple. So this is kind of the process approach that I'm kind of aiming for here. So my fundamental approach is that we're all motivated by certain instincts, certain desires, and that one of these is attachment and recognition, that we want to be recognized by others, that ideally we want to be recognized authentically by others for who we are rather than how we present ourselves to be, but that's a very difficult task. You can't do it with everyone. You tend to do that with only a few people. Social media technology complicates these things a little bit. So we like to be recognized in different ways by different people. Facebook puts it all in one place. Twitter is a different kind of expression. But it's a motivation that's deeply unconscious, deeply profound, and as intense, I believe, as hunger or thirst. And we know that children do not thrive if they don't get recognition and love from the start. That recognition, love, attachment really ought to be on that bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy, which is now pretty... We know Wi-Fi is the bottom level, but outside of that. We're not unitary in our psychological makeup by any means, even to ourselves. Okay, so we lie to ourselves because we like to be better than we are. So what happens to the parts that we're not better than? And then what happens when we have to present that? Things go into the shadow. This is the psychological nature of privacy. So Eva was talking about sort of the technical aspects and the ethical aspects of privacy, but this is what's psychological about it. Why we're private, because it has meaning to us about what parts of ourselves we want to show to others to see whether they're going to be accepted or not. So there's nothing I like better than putting Freud in a lecture to tech people. Well, there are a few things I like better, but this is, at the top of the list. So Freud gave us a really good model to think about how the personality works. Outdated, yeah. A little bit reductive, yeah. I accept all these things, but this is a half-hour lecture based on a big fat book. So I'm going to reduce it down to the basics. So Freud says that the ego in its relation to the id is like that of a rider of a horse. The horse supplies the energy while the rider guides this energy to a specific goal. So if you remember what the id is, this is the it. This is our passions. These are our darker desires. These are our aggressive feelings, our antisocial bits that all of us have, that our ego protects us, most of us anyway, most of the time, given alcohol and other kind of considerations, from expressing immediately. Yeah, we repress it and we try to act in a way that's more socially acceptable. But sometimes the rider is able to guide the horse, and other times the rider is obliged to go where the horse takes her. So sometimes we are consumed by our passions and we go the direction of our passions. So as a model of personality, we can think pretty broadly. Ego, that's me, I, which mitigates the worlds between the external world and the internal world. Yeah? So what I say, what I feel, and what I communicate to you. There's the id, which is in the background, all our passions, dreams, fantasies, desires, antisocial stuff. And then on top of that, we have our ego, our superego, which is kind of like a consciousness, our morality, what tells us is right and wrong, has very high expectations of what we should do, and then we can never fulfill them. So this is, you were talking about your superego, Nathalie, in the Presidio, weren't you? She's like, okay, take your superego out of the equation, and let's find out what you need. Yeah? So we can kind of think about these sorts of things in popular culture. So, he's the front of the ship. He's the superego, logic, this is the good stuff and this is the bad stuff. And of course we have the passions and the id. For those of you that are next gen people, I'm sure you would replace probably Worf over here, Data over there, and Picard in the middle. I'm adding myself as kind of a Trekkie. Okay, also kind of reductive ideas of what these things are, but you kind of get the point. Also, we think about horrible bosses. What happens to the ego when he's stuck between what one should do and what one wants? It's kind of this confused, sort of gibbering wreck. The ego has a really, really hard time managing all these things. The ego is the synthesizing aspect of what we do. It's what makes the choices, and it's pulled hither and thither on all sides. So Sherry Turkle, who's a great theorist of psychology and technology, has stated that technology proposes itself as the architect of our intimacies. Really, really important because we're going to be talking about architecture all day today. And what happens is all of the stuff in our unconscious that behaves outwardly in the world through our egos then goes through technology to express itself. So technology operates as an extension of our psychological needs and desires, but because technology is an architecture, it limits the ways in which we can express those desires. So if our desires are for a certain kind of recognition and attachment, Skype allows a certain availability of that, Twitter, another availability of that, Facebook, etc. So all of those will access different psychological states in different ways. So all in all, what we always have, two complex selves interacting. In the room, it's the highest complexity that you've got, facial expression, language, tone of voice, body movement, all of it. When we start to move into technology, we start to reduce complexity, which is important because the reduction of complexity means we need to fill in the blanks with more things, and we do that psychologically also. So we see technology as functioning between selves and flowing through so that the self-desires flow through the technology, and then that architecture of that technology does stuff with the stuff that we're putting through. Yeah? So if I put desire through Facebook, it looks different than if I put it through Cam 4, for example. But different architectures, of course, have different results. So when we think about Facebook, Facebook is very ego-based psychology because it's about the presentation of self. Now, ego is a big thing, yeah, because it's also our subjectivity and our identity. It's the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And when we tell ourselves stories about who we are on Facebook, we're doing it in a particular social culture. So we generally choose the people who are around us on Facebook, and then we have an investment into how those people see us. So how we curate ourselves on there is going to be a very egoic expression. So I think Facebook, in a way, is very ego-based. And I don't mean narcissistic necessarily, but it is an outward-facing, ego-based social network. And if you think about how that works, basically, it makes the ego lean outwards, yeah? So the ego kind of, like I said, mediates between the internal world and the external world. But when it's thinking about the external world, it's saying, okay, this is how I want the world to see me. So it kind of leans in this direction. And then Facebook has also an inflationary effect on that outward-leaning ego. So what's important here is that outward bit leans out, but it also casts a shadow behind it, yeah? So what is missing when we're presenting ourselves this way all the time? Something gets left out of the picture. And we know psychologically when stuff goes unrecognized, because there's no authentic recognition going on there, there's going to be a lack, and there might be a compensation for that lack. Now, fortunately, people aren't just expressing themselves on Facebook, so some of these shadow things will be expressed elsewhere, but this is what happens across the social network. You look at something like LinkedIn, you have a very similar situation, except it's kind of up another level. So there's a professional ego, outward-facing thing there, much more to the exclusion of other stuff. But then you've also got this sort of super egoic cap on top. So there's an idealized vision of who you should be because it's like you're in constant job interview, in a sense. So you get, ids out of the picture, and it's my best professional self. That's why LinkedIn's so boring. You look at something like the Silk Road, for example, which I guess we can't look at anymore, in which Jamie's written so nicely about. Also, selves functioning through an online social network of sorts, which plugs into id stuff. So these are our passions, and our passions, aggressive feelings, we're talking guns, drugs, and porn, yeah, for the most part, and fraud, okay? So talk about non-social compliance, this is id stuff, and we get to bypass ego pretty freely through the anonymity of it. And I could put Twitter up here too if you're anonymous on Twitter. Twitter invites trolling more so because you can go on there anonymously. You can bypass the personal ego and go someplace a little bit more nasty. I mean, we can talk a lot more about things like online social inhibition and disinhibition and that sort of thing. But you can kind of see the aim here, in a sense, is the architecture of a given network enables and disables aspects of our psychology, and our psychology is exactly the same as it was 20 years ago, 100 years ago, and 5,000 years ago, yeah? We have to have our basic needs met, and we have to, if you think about the village effect, have good relationships with others. And this is why we have Facebook depression, Facebook anxiety, because when we feel like we've broken those rules, it's not like you just fucked up on Facebook, but actually there's a sense of social death. Okay, fundamentally, psychologically, we discover ourselves between ourselves and others. When we are babies, developmental psychology. If I had more time, I'd give you a quick little primer in developmental psych. The ego and the identity develops in relation to primary others. Super important. We continue to know ourselves through other people for the rest of our lives. Social media limits this in important ways. Like I just said. Okay, so kind of to start to sum up, we can kind of look at a model that looks like this. Big unconscious drives, many of which we are unaware of ourselves, sits under the self and mediates our relation to others. We get this kind of big, fat pipe, in a sense. I get to use my laser printer, my laser thing now. We get a big fat pipe, in a sense, that goes from our unconscious to our self, and when we have self to real other self interaction, we also have a big fat pipe, because that's really Freudian, isn't it? The highest level of complexity between selves is widest there. When we start to express it through technology, the pipe narrows, because complexity necessarily narrows, yeah? And then we express it to others by way of the pipe, there's more narrowing. So we're always losing complexity when communicating with others around attachment and recognition issues online. So your raw unconscious is the largest amount of complexity, where everything's there. Our egos actually keep some of that stuff hidden from us, which is why we tend to dream it at night, or we tend to act out when we're drunk, or we have wild fantasies. Narrowing in relation to others. The other thing that's important about technology is it offers us a low bar. Okay, so everything becomes very much easier to interact with. So where we would have had to have worked very hard to physically stalk someone and find out stuff about them back in the days, we don't have to do that anymore. When I was a kid, we had to work pretty hard to get our hands on pornography. We don't have to do that anymore either. So the bar is lowered for all of these kinds of self-expressions, and there's another consequence for that. And one of the ones that I'll just talk about very briefly is Tinderization of everyday life. Okay, so Tinderization has to do with the amount of choice that one has in relation to the billions of people that are through your technology, and the low bar. It's in your pocket, you just turn it on, there you are. Okay, so you have your unconscious, which is under here somewhere, with your big, wide complexity, and then you have narrowing tech, narrowing again, but then also joining up with loads of others, so it's kind of confusing and overwhelming choice. And what happens when you have a narrowing of complexity and overwhelming choice and a low bar at the same time is the objectification of others. Yeah? So others can be dropped and picked up very easily. Swipe left, swipe right. Swipe left, swipe right. You can turn off messages on Facebook. You can unfollow people on Twitter. You can delete and block on emails. The bar is low to cut people out, which means our defenses can be high, our transferences can be high, our projections can be high, and I sound like I'm being dystopian right now, don't I? And I'm not, because I think hopefully through something like social shaping and conferences like this, we can develop social media that's more sensitive to emotional and psychological needs. But at the moment, these are a lot of the consequences of our current social networks. So to finish up, we extend our psychological selves by way of technology. So we have to see technology as a not good, not bad, but not neutral tool through which we extend our human needs, just like we extend our needs to build things through machinery. Yeah, it's an extension of our arms. This is an extension of our psychological self, primarily through the mode of recognition and attachment. One of our main psychological motivation is the recognition of others and to be recognized by others ourselves. We need to be recognized by different people in different contexts in a variety of different ways, and we have a whole variety of architectures through which we do this, all of which have one thing in common, which is the complexity, the way of complexity is narrower than it is in real life. Technology mediates these drives by ways of these particular architectures, so we have to think very closely about what architecture enables and disables when it comes to our psychological selves. So, as I said before, this is kind of a very distilled version. It might be a bit reductive. I hope, if you wanted to have a look more at my book, you'll see it's not quite as reductive when it's thought through, but I think it's an accessible model for you to think about how psychologically and unconsciously we engage with technology and online social media. And we can have some questions. Go, Renee.
No, you have a lot of time. I want to get on stage because I want to ask the first question. I would thank you. That was an extraordinarily good lecture. I want to ask you how with all of this knowledge that you have about how aspects of ourself are either disabled or enabled through the particular channels that we use, how conscious you are of that effect in the specific channels that you choose to engage in social online.
Okay. Yeah, so there's been a definite real effect. Okay, so I call it relational light. So like in my L-I-T-E, like Coke Light. So in my job as a psychotherapist, we kind of demand, in a sense, full relational integrity in the consultation room. So I work really hard to see all of those parts that otherwise someone wouldn't keep out of the room, because it's important for your development as a human being to be witnessed for things that you are ashamed of and feel guilty about as much as the things that you feel positive about. We don't tend to do this on our online social networks. What we get is relational light, which is basically what you get from a like button, a follow, or a retweet.
Yeah.
So when we think about wide complexity, like if I want to get some kind of recognition from you as another human being, and you're standing here and we're having a conversation, working through sameness and difference, difficulty sometimes, it's fulfilling because you're working for it, in a sense. When you click a like button or receive a like button, it's easy because the bar is low, but it feels good still because it plugs right into that basic emotional need for recognition by others. So I notice myself enjoying likes and follows and retweets just as much as everyone else. And I also notice myself, and this is, I think, is a danger for everyone, being in a complex, challenging relationship and still wanting to look and see if those likes are there. So I think it's kind of like choosing between a healthy meal and a donut. Like I'm not much of a I never want a salad, really. I never want a salad. So if I'm going to get a salad, it's got to be work. It's like I got to eat a salad because it's healthy for me. I'd much rather have a donut. And I think social media often gives us donuts when we should be eating salads.
All right, let's open the floor for some questions.
Okay.
Go on.
Angela Merkel, she recently made a comment. I thought it was very good. She said, yeah, Facebook, it's nice to have. It's like a good dishwasher. It's a good thing to have. So I'm just wondering, with your insights on the human psyche and our id, do you not think that that's so stable that we somehow manage to understand how to deal with it? So are we not just in this blip of history where we have this new thing and we're all looking at it intensely, like the Victorians, they were having parties, looking intensely at electricity and flicking the light switch on and off and talking about electricity without end, because isn't it fantastic? But, don't you think Facebook will just turn into a dishwasher? It's nice to have, and we know what it is and what it isn't. I mean, don't you think we are thousands of years more stable than we are just going to all run off a cliff?
I don't think we're going to run off a cliff, but to bring back the food metaphor, if I can. So if you want to replace attachment needs for physical needs, and we go back to thousands of years ago, what do we need? We needed fat, protein, carbohydrate, and sugar. So what have we created? McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, Pizza Hut. What do we have? A massive obesity crisis. So we create... Not everywhere. No. But in the part of the world, and in the parts of the world that we export this, we tend to create it again. And why do we do that? Because it meets the basic needs, because we're still thousands of years old, and it's not necessarily good for us. So while I believe that something like social shaping of technology, I think we are in a blip, and I think the internet looks like it does now, and it moves so fast it's going to look very different. What worries me is we often create what we want, but we don't create what we need. And I think we've created a lot of what we think we want, but we probably don't need. So we have to think very carefully and critically about how we share and use architecture of online space.
Hang on. Let's do Anne first, and then we'll do you. Split it up. Gender diversity.
Oh, awesome. Hello. Thank you. That was really awesome. I just was wondering what would the alternative Tinder would look like that doesn't objectify people. Basically, what would be the conditions that have to be fulfilled in order to avoid this objectification? So
we need a different kind of language, and we need a more complex kind of language. And I'm not sure we're going to get a replacement anyway. Like I think ideally you have technology that sits on top of human interpersonal needs. So, for example, Skype operates really beautifully that way. That if you live, as I do, 4,000 miles away from family, then Skype can offer a pretty fair psychological relationship to those people. However, some new research coming out about people who are doing something like psychotherapy over Skype, it's not very encouraging, actually, because the loss that you get in that kind of recognition of being in the same room with someone is possibly a pretty big one. And I'm conducting my own research in this area, and one of the things about Skype and in your computer is say you have your psychotherapy session in real life, you go there, don't you? You walk there, you get off the tube, you walk up the steps, you start getting nervous, you go in there, you use lots of tissues, you walk out, you think about it, you think about it hard. You're doing it by Skype, you're answering your emails, you're turning off, you're doing all this kind of stuff, the thing rings, there's your therapist, blah, 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 click, they're gone, you're back to your emails again. So the banality of the platform does not invite intimacy. So you might have to think about something in which you have to go to a different place. I mean, if you can do it by technology, you don't move from email to something intimate to email again. Yeah, just like you don't, make love and open up your laptop, or at least you should wait a little. Yeah, so you want to wait a little while, a respectful amount of time, but kind of honoring emotional and intimate experience.
Martin, go for it. Sure, go on, Yvette, and then we'll come to Yvette and then Ron. Yeah.
Also on the Tinder subject, do you think, because when I use Tinder, I see a lot of people have very simplified profiles. Well, I have a very descriptive profile myself, but there are a lot of people who seem to really enjoy having this reduced version of themselves there. Do you think that's just fear of showing personality, or could it also be that we that we overcomplicated intimacy? That it's maybe very nice to have a very simplistic way to create intimate relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're right back to the question of architecture here. So in a way, Tinder's much more honest than, say, Guardian Soulmates or any of the big ones, because in a sense you're saying, this is what I want to, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I look like. You're interested or you're not interested. Yeah. Whereas there's nothing more honest about necessarily having more text there. You just have more ability to curate something. But they also lend themselves to what you're looking for. So if you're going on Guardian Soulmates or any other dating application, you are looking for a longer term sort of a thing. You want to get a bit more information before you get involved. Which does not mean that you can't find someone great on Tinder because you're lucky or because there's a match there. So again, if you want to shag, Tinder is great for that. If you want to develop more, there's I guess a fair enough chance that can happen over Tinder. It does. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's a rare thing, but I think you have to understand that you're engaging in an architecture that asks for a certain sort of thing, and that's the experience that you're going to get. The problem with both of them is the low bar again, and then what happens. So when the bar is low and complexity is narrow, the rest is filled with fantasy. And I think people are being less able to deal with interpersonal complexity, particularly disappointment when the other person isn't who you wish them to be, which I hate to break it to you, they never ever will be. They just won't, because people are different from each other. And the whole point of a successful relationship is managing difference. So if you can, whether you meet on Tinder or Guardian Soulmates, if you can work yourself through those first 2, 3, 4 ruptures and breakdowns in the relationship and renegotiate and come back together and work it out, it's fine. But if you keep finding the first time you run into difference, you're backing away and you're backing away, you're backing away, you're not testing your relational skills, you're staying at the low bar in narrow complexity.
Well, let's take 2 more and then we'll go to break. So Ron, what was your question?
Yeah, I was just triggered by your great presentation here, and especially the process that you call where people become an object, so objectification. And I had the feeling I see the same thing going on with people in industry who are working hard at conversion management, especially all kinds of trained psychologists. And I see them using psychological techniques which sometimes are so hidden in themselves that I find that issue warrants a discussion of what's the level of respect that you have for the other party and the degree of covertness of the instruments that you apply. Mm-hmm. In that discussion I had last week with a group of conversion managers in the Netherlands, I posed a thesis about objectification leads conversion managers to dehumanize people and consider everything is fair in love and war, and any trick they can invent up to ego depletion. Now, my interest is writing about this issue and coming up with strategies to turn that around. So I would be very interested to learn from you some insights and ideas about when people are in this process of objectification, are there any useful strategies where you can turn it around? Because that could help make the web more human as well.
Let me just throw in a proviso there, and I don't want it to sound again kind of unhopeful, but Freud himself said the aim of psychoanalysis is to turn neurotic misery into ordinary unhappiness, and so he wasn't very optimistic about the process. I think actually we can do better than that today, but the thing is, a 12-year-old kid running a lemonade stand is objectifying their clients. Yeah? They want 10 cents for every lemonade they sell. So we're not, in some ways, we're not doing anything differently. Yeah? Even in sex, in relationships, and in commerce, we tend to objectify people anyway, and we actually have to work hard to de-objectify them. It's easier to de-objectify them in real life because there's so much feedback coming back all the time. You can't just pretend there's something else or pretend they're not there. So I think on one level, we have to accept that there's going to be a degree of objectification, particularly for people we don't know who are at a great distance, who are coming at us through narrow networks. What I think is at issue here is consent, dishonesty, and manipulation. And I think, like Ava was saying, I think we need to have a clarity, we need to have basic, easy, social, ethical contracts that we're engaged in, that we're going to do this and we're not going to do this, that we're honest about selling you burgers, but there's a consequence for those burgers. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think you have to accept a certain degree of objectification, but what you don't want to do is just keep ramping that up for your own advantage.
Is there a sense that objectification has always been used as a bad word? I mean, I edited a magazine for 8 years where I was accused of objectifying women. It's a terrible thing. So it all sounds like now we have to process information quickly. It's actually quite useful.
Well, there's something to be said for narrowing complexity because we're all overwhelmed with complexity. But I think the last thing we should be narrowing are other people. And I think that's what the Tinderization of everyday life is, the narrowing of other people into objects. So, there's different choices. You're engaged in relationship, or you're engaged in commerce, or you're engaged in ethical commerce. And I think there's going to be different levels. But I think there's got to be authenticity, honesty, and clarity. I think this thing, 50 pages of terms and conditions, it's manipulative, it's dishonest, and it's wrong. This is what we're going to do, sign up or not, and then you make that choice.
I think we're going to leave it there and go for the break. Aaron will be around. Let him have his coffee first, but if you want to ask him any more questions, he's going to be around. Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.